Vanderpost is a man of many accomplishments. He's recognized throughout the Western world as a distinguished author and statesman. Perhaps he is most well known for his successful efforts to preserve the life and the culture of the Bushmen of the Kalahari. Vanderpost was born in 1906 in South Africa to a large and distinguished family. At the age of 20, he left South Africa to pursue a career as a journalist in London. During World War II and in the years after, Vanderpost served as a special envoy for Britain in the Far East and in Africa. In 1981, he was knighted for his many years of public services to the Queen. In this conversation, we hear how Vanderpost came to know C.G. Jung of Switzerland. He speaks of the value of Jung's discoveries for the evolution of the modern world. Before this, Vanderpost had expressed his appreciation for Jung and his psychology in two very extensive works. One, a feature-length film on Jung's life, which Vanderpost wrote and produced for the BBC, and the other, a poetic and candid biography of Jung published in 1975. This conversation took place in the winter of 1978 in the living room of Sir Lawrence's home in Chelsea, where he lives with his wife, Ingeret Giffard, a noted Jungian analyst of London. I would like to hear the story of how you met C.G. Jung in the first place.
Well, it's a very simple and yet a very complicated story, because the odds against my meeting him would have seemed insuperable, because whenever people had spoken to me about him in the past, although I think I have a natural interest in what is called the field of psychology, because of Freud, my experience of Freud, and Jung's association with Freud, I completely rejected Jung, and I wasn't really interested. And then I came back from about 11, 12 years of continuous war, and I was still technically in the British Army, and I just dropped my uniform in London, and I went to Zurich, where my wife happened to be working at the time with Freddie Meyer and Tony Wolff in particular, and to a certain extent with Emma and C.G. Jung. And then they had one of these sort of parties they had for the Institute, and I was asked to come along, and I found myself put next to Jung. And that's how I met him. And then he happened to be at that moment talking to some eminent Dutch scholar, and they were talking about fire and the meaning of fire. And this Dutch scholar said, oh, well, of course, it's just energy, isn't it, fire? I've never forgotten the look on Jung's face, you know, because that anybody could just think of fire as energy. It was so remote. Of course, it's that as well. And I started to join in there. And I told them about how, when I'd been dropped into the jungles of Malaya, I discovered a very interesting primitive tribe called the Sakai, who made fire in a completely different way. And Jung was immediately interested. He said, how do they make it? And I said, well, it's very wet, it's always raining, so the Sakai, who go about naked, they carry a little belt, leather belt, and at the end of this they have a block of wood, in the center of which is a very deep cylinder, and the top of it is a kind of lid which has a rod attached to it, which fits exactly into the cylinder. And at the end of the rod, there's a very deep niche carved. And they have a little leather pouch full of dry moss, and they put the moss into the niche, and they put the cylinder into at least they put the rod into the opening of the cylinder, and then they knock the two together. And then they pull it out, and the moss is on fire. And I said to Jung that when I saw this, I had a man who was an engineer with me, and he turned to me and he said, "My God, Colonel, the diesel engine." And that was too much for Jung. And I heard him laugh. He roared with laughter, you know. The primitive people already, out of the collective unconscious, had the diesel engine principle working, you know. And I think it was that laugh of his which got me. And then we started talking immediately. It's a most extraordinary laugh that Jung had, you know. Because I remember Olga Fröber-Kaptein, who founded Eranos on the lakes of Ascona, told me that very often when Jung was talking there, and they sat round, they had a great round table at Eranos, where I've sat myself when I lectured there. And just above the table, you had the main road from Italy to Switzerland, and masses of cars going by. And Jung would sit there after the lecture, and they would have wine, and he would laugh. And Olga said it was amazing the numbers of times strangers would come down from the road, stop their cars, and say, "Would you mind showing us who that was who laughed just now?" His laugh had that kind of primordial quality of laughter. It was a laugh almost more of somebody who had been infected by the gods than, you know, it was really quite infectious.
You know, I'm very interested in the fact that he had important and deep relationship with women.
It's one of the most important things, my dear, in Jung. One must never think about Jung without remembering his love of and for women, his love of the feminine in man, as well as for the feminine in women, and the service he performed for women, and the enormous service which women performed for him. Because I think myself that in a scientific way, completely scientific way, Jung did for the world what Dante did in a poetic way. But whereas Dante was inspired by a beautiful feminine face, the face of Beatrice, face of a girl he just saw in the streets of Florence, and which led him from then on right through his life. Jung had the shattering originality to be inspired by what you might call the ugly face of womankind. Jung had an instinct that what was wrong with life, what made life tear apart, made it incomplete, was because the feminine was rejected. And even in his very, very first book, which he called The Psychology of the Unconscious, I think it's now called Roots of the Unconscious, which led to his break with Freud. Because if there's one thing that Freud didn't have conspicuously in his makeup, it was a sense of the importance of the feminine. I mean, Freud was very much an Old Testament phenomenon. He was a prophet. He was a very great man. I'm not saying this to belittle him, but merely to understand him. He was a very great person, a very great pioneer to whom we owe a lot. But he was an Old Testament phenomenon, and I think more of Jung as a New Testament phenomenon. But Jung had this sense of the rejected feminine enormously. When you go back into his life. And particularly if you go into the case histories which he's left behind in the Burgholtze, which I've done. It's very, very interesting to me how most of the cases that really gripped him were the cases of women who had gone, as they called it then, insane. And there was this famous case of this woman, I think her name was Babette, who in the Burgholtze hospital, who'd been there for donkey's years, the one who said, you know, Naples and I, between us, must supply the world with spaghetti. And everybody said, my God, she's crazy. Do you see? She's crazy. What is she talking about? To Jung, it was very significant because he saw in this a law of compensation, that she was trying to put herself into an important role because she was feeling neglected. She'd lost her identity. And he learned an enormous amount from this old lady. And when Freud visited Jung in Zurich for the first time, Jung took Freud to see this old lady. And Freud said to Jung afterwards, yes, I can see that she's an interesting case, but isn't she a hideous old lady? I would hate to spend my time with her. And to Jung, this was quite a shock, he told me. It nearly bowled him over because he'd never thought of her in those terms. That's what I mean, that he could follow, not like Dante, the outward beauty and face of womankind, as most men do, but he could follow the inner face, the averted, the rejected face of women. And so it was not surprising that when he came across the papers in the case of this extraordinary Miss Miller, who had these fantasies,